Late at night, Judge Malcolm Carter drove home after a long day in court. The streets were quiet, the city lights flickering against the dark sky. He had handled several cases that day, some difficult, some straightforward, but now all he wanted was to reach home, take off his suit, and rest. As he drove, he noticed a police car in his rearview mirror. It had been behind him for a while, and he could tell the officer was watching him. A moment later, flashing red and blue lights filled his car. A sigh escaped his lips as he pulled over to the side of the road. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't broken any laws. There was no reason for this stop, but Malcolm had been in this situation before. He had seen how things could go wrong for people who looked like him, even when they had done nothing wrong. The officer, a tall man with sharp features, stepped out of his patrol car. His expression was unreadable as he approached Malcolm's window. "License and registration," he said without greeting. Malcolm kept his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for his wallet, pulling out his identification. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" His voice was calm but firm. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he took the license. He glanced at it, then at Malcolm. "Where are you coming from?" he asked instead of answering the question. Malcolm met his gaze. "From work. I'm a judge. That information is on my ID." The officer raised an eyebrow and let out a small chuckle. "A judge, huh?" His tone was doubtful, almost amused. "That's a good one." Malcolm remained composed, but inside, he felt a familiar frustration building. "Yes, and I would still like to know the reason for this stop." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over the car, scanning it like he was searching for something out of place. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. "Step out of the vehicle." There it was. No explanation, no valid reason. Just an order. Malcolm hesitated. He knew his rights. He had spent years upholding the law, ensuring fairness in the courtroom. But outside of it, he wasn't being treated with the same respect. His instincts told him to push back, but his experience told him this situation could turn dangerous if he wasn't careful. "Is there a reason I need to step out of my car?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. The officer's jaw tightened. "Don't make this difficult," he muttered. "Just step out." Malcolm exhaled slowly and unbuckled his seatbelt. He had done nothing wrong, yet he knew this wouldn't end quickly. As he opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night suddenly felt colder. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, not drawing his weapon, but letting Malcolm know it was there. Malcolm met his gaze once more, calm but unwavering. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. "Now," the officer said, flipping his flashlight on and pointing it at Malcolm's face. "Let's see who you really are." Malcolm stood still under the harsh beam of the officer's flashlight. His face remained calm, but inside frustration simmered. He had handled courtroom battles, cross-examinations, and legal debates, yet here he was, being treated like a suspect on the street for no reason at all. The officer, still holding his identification, stared at it for a long moment. "Judge Malcolm Carter," he muttered, almost like he didn't believe it. Then he let out a small chuckle. "That's a nice fake ID you got there." Malcolm's brows lifted slightly. A fake ID. The thought was almost laughable. He had spent years working his way up in the legal system, earning respect in courtrooms. And now, standing on the side of the road, he was being accused of lying about his own identity. "That's my real ID," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "You can verify it in your system." The officer smirked. "Yeah? And how do I know you didn't make this up? People lie all the time." His tone was casual, almost mocking. He didn't even try to hide his suspicion. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "If you run my name through your database, you'll see that I am exactly who I say I am." The officer didn't move. Instead, he folded his arms, still gripping the ID between his fingers. "And what if I don't feel like doing that?" he asked. "What if I think you're trying to be clever with me?" Malcolm studied him carefully. He could see what was happening here. The officer wasn't interested in the truth. He had already decided how this interaction was going to go. He had judged Malcolm based on nothing but an assumption. And now, instead of correcting his mistake, he was doubling down. "I've given you my license, my registration, and my identification as a judge," Malcolm said. "Is there any reason you're refusing to verify them?" The officer's smirk faded slightly. He didn't like being challenged. A tense silence followed. The street was empty, the only sound the occasional car passing by in the distance. The officer glanced at Malcolm's car, then back at him, as if he were still trying to find something, anything that would justify his actions. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio and called for backup. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten. Backup? For what? He had remained calm, followed instructions, and had done nothing wrong. But now, more officers were coming, all because one man refused to admit he might be wrong. The officer returned his gaze to Malcolm, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You're acting suspicious," he said. "I think we need to take a closer look at you." Malcolm didn't flinch. He had faced unfair situations before. But this one was different. This time, he wasn't just another citizen being harassed. He was a judge, and soon, this officer would realize just how big of a mistake he was making. The night air felt heavier as Malcolm stood on the side of the road, waiting. The officer had called for backup, and now he stood with his arms crossed, watching Malcolm like he was a dangerous criminal instead of a law-abiding citizen. The silence stretched between them, only broken by the faint sound of approaching sirens. Malcolm had dealt with injustice before. He had seen it in his courtroom, had ruled against it, had spent his career ensuring fairness under the law. But now he was on the other side of it. He was not Judge Carter in this moment. He was just another man being treated unfairly for no reason at all. A second police car pulled up behind the first one, red and blue lights flashing against the dark street. Two more officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they approached. The first officer, Officer Sanders, as Malcolm now noticed on his badge, handed over his ID to one of them, a tall officer with graying hair. "This guy claims he's a judge," Sanders said, shaking his head. "What do you think?" The older officer took the ID and studied it. His expression didn't change, but Malcolm could see the hesitation in his eyes. The badge number, the legal seal, the name, everything was legitimate. If he checked the system, he would see the truth. Malcolm cleared his throat. "Officer, I've already asked for the reason behind this stop. I was following the speed limit. I wasn't driving erratically, and I've provided my identification. There is no legal reason for this to continue." The older officer exhaled, glancing at Sanders. "Did you run his information yet?" Sanders scoffed. "No need. Something feels off. I think he's hiding something." Hiding something. Malcolm almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He was standing in a business suit, on his way home from work, with a spotless record. And yet, in Sanders' eyes, he was a suspect. The older officer hesitated, then turned to Malcolm. "Sir, do you have any weapons in the car?" Malcolm met his gaze. "No, officer. And you don't have probable cause to search it." Sanders let out a low chuckle. "Look at that. Knows the law, huh? Well, if you've got nothing to hide, then stepping aside shouldn't be a problem, right?" Malcolm didn't move. "I have the right to refuse an unlawful search." The older officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable. He knew Malcolm was right. He knew there was no real reason to continue this. But Sanders was determined. Without warning, Sanders reached for Malcolm's arm. "Turn around," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Malcolm stiffened. "Are you arresting me?" "Resisting a lawful investigation," Sanders said casually, tightening his grip. The moment was surreal. 1 second, Malcolm was driving home. The next, he was being treated like a criminal. As the cold metal of the handcuffs locked around his wrists, he took a deep breath. He wouldn't resist. He wouldn't give them any excuse. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Malcolm sat in the back of the police cruiser, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The cold metal pressed against his wrists, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing. He had spent years inside courtrooms, ensuring justice was served, making sure the law protected the innocent. And yet here he was, being treated like a suspect for no reason other than one officer's assumption. The drive to the police station felt longer than it should have. The car was silent except for the crackle of the radio and the hum of the engine. Officer Sanders sat in the front, a slight smirk on his face as he tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. Malcolm didn't speak. He knew that anything he said now would likely be twisted. He had seen it happen to others before. When they finally arrived at the station, the doors opened and Sanders pulled Malcolm out of the car. Other officers were inside, some chatting over coffee, others focused on their paperwork. But as soon as Malcolm stepped in, hands cuffed, heads turned. One officer, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, froze mid-sip of his coffee. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized the face before him. "Judge Carter?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The room fell silent. Sanders frowned, glancing between Malcolm and the officer. "Wait, you know this guy." The mustached officer set down his coffee and stood up straighter. "Yeah, I know him. That's Judge Malcolm Carter. He's been on the bench for years." His expression darkened. "Why is he in cuffs?" Sanders shrugged. "Guy was acting suspicious. Gave me a fake judge ID. Thought I'd bring him in and let you all figure it out." The silence in the room became heavier. Malcolm could see the shift happening. The realization, the discomfort, the dawning awareness that a mistake had been made. Just then, another man stepped out of an office. He was older, with gray hair and a serious expression. His uniform bore the name Captain Rodriguez. As soon as he saw Malcolm, his face hardened. "What is going on here?" Rodriguez's voice was sharp. Sanders, looking slightly less sure of himself, straightened. "Sir, I pulled this guy over. Thought he was using fake credentials. He wouldn't cooperate, so I brought him in." Rodriguez's eyes moved to Malcolm's hands, still cuffed behind his back. His jaw clenched. "Take those off. Now." There was no hesitation in his voice. Sanders hesitated, but at a single sharp look from Rodriguez, he pulled out his key and unlocked the cuffs. Malcolm rubbed his wrists, watching as the room shifted, the tension thick between the officers. Rodriguez turned to Sanders, his voice low and firm. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Sanders scoffed, crossing his arms. "I was doing my job." Rodriguez stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure everyone in the room could hear. "You arrested a sitting judge without probable cause. Do you understand the kind of trouble you're in?" For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Sanders' face. Malcolm took a deep breath. He had known this moment was coming. But now, as he stood there, free but still feeling the weight of what had happened, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The station remained silent as Captain Rodriguez stared at Officer Sanders. The weight of the situation had settled over everyone in the room. A judge had been arrested without cause, and now there would be consequences. Malcolm took a slow breath, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. He had faced unfair situations before, but this wasn't just about him. This was about a system that too often let officers like Sanders act without accountability. Rodriguez turned toward Malcolm, his expression regretful. "Judge Carter, I sincerely apologize for this. You should never have been brought in like this." Malcolm nodded but didn't reply yet. He wanted to hear what happened next. Rodriguez shifted his gaze back to Sanders. "I want a full explanation. Right now." Sanders still had his arms crossed, though some of his earlier confidence had faded. "He was acting suspicious," he muttered. "Didn't answer my questions the way I wanted. I was just being cautious." Rodriguez's eyes darkened. "Cautious? You pulled over a man who broke no laws. You ignored his identification, refused to verify it. and then arrested him. That's not caution. That's reckless. Some of the other officers exchanged glances. They knew Sanders had overstepped, but no one had spoken up until now. Rodriguez turned to another officer behind the desk. "Run Judge Carter's ID through the system now." The officer nodded and quickly typed on his computer. Within seconds, the results came up. He looked at Rodriguez and nodded. "His ID is real. Judge Malcolm Carter, active status." Rodriguez exhaled sharply. So there it is. Official confirmation that he is exactly who he said he was. He turned back to Sanders. "You didn't even check, did you?" Sanders' jaw tightened, but he had no excuse left. Rodriguez shook his head. "Effective immediately, you are suspended while we conduct a formal review. Turn in your badge and gun." Sanders' eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "You heard me." Rodriguez's voice was firm. "You violated protocol, used poor judgment, and abused your authority. That's not what we stand for." For a moment, Sanders looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew there was no point. He sighed heavily and unhooked his badge, placing it on the desk. He then pulled his service weapon from its holster and set it down. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps heavy with frustration. Rodriguez turned back to Malcolm. "Judge Carter, I know this doesn't fix what happened, but I want you to know we will be handling this situation seriously." Malcolm finally spoke. "What happens next matters more than what just happened. If this happened to me, a judge, then how many others have been treated the same way but had no voice?" Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I understand. What do you want to do next?" Malcolm thought for a moment. He could press charges, demand a public apology, or make a bigger statement. But instead, an idea formed in his mind, one that would ensure real change. "I want a meeting," he said finally, "with the department's leadership, and I want Sanders there." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You still want to talk to him?" "Yes," Malcolm said, "because he's not the only one who needs to learn from this." A few weeks had passed since the meeting at the police department, and changes had already begun to take shape. The new bias training program was officially announced, requiring every officer to attend multiple sessions on fair policing, reasonable suspicion, and understanding personal bias. A civilian review board was also created, allowing community members to report incidents and ensure transparency in how complaints were handled. Malcolm watched everything unfold with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't expected instant change, but he had hoped for action, and now that hope was becoming reality. However, there was still one thing unresolved: Officer Sanders. Malcolm hadn't heard much about him since the meeting. Some officers had resigned rather than go through the new training, but Sanders wasn't one of them. He had remained silent, attending every required session, but Malcolm wondered if he had truly changed, or if he was just waiting for the storm to pass. One afternoon, as Malcolm was leaving the courthouse, he saw someone waiting near his car. It was Sanders, dressed in casual clothes instead of his uniform. He looked different, less defensive, more uncertain. Malcolm approached him cautiously. "Officer Sanders," he said evenly. Sanders cleared his throat. "Not an officer anymore. Not yet, at least. I'm still on suspension." Malcolm studied him. "What can I do for you?" Sanders hesitated before speaking. "I've been attending the training, reading the reports, going through case studies of unfair stops. It's eye-opening." He looked down for a moment, then back at Malcolm. "I was wrong." Malcolm remained silent, letting him continue. "I thought I was just doing my job that night," Sanders admitted. "But now I see that I wasn't. I assumed things about you that weren't true. And if I did that to you, then I must have done it to others too." Malcolm nodded slightly. "Acknowledging it is the first step, but what matters now is what you do next." Sanders sighed. "I want to make it right. If I get reinstated, I want to be part of the solution. I want to help train other officers, make sure this doesn't keep happening." Malcolm studied him carefully. Was this real change, or just an attempt to clear his name. But something about Sanders' voice, his expression, felt different. "Then prove it," Malcolm said simply. "Not to me, but to the people you serve." Sanders nodded, understanding. "I will." As he walked away, Malcolm leaned against his car, watching him go. People could change, but only if they truly wanted to. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. Months passed, and the changes Malcolm had fought for were finally taking root. The police department had fully implemented mandatory bias training, and officers were now required to undergo regular evaluations on their conduct. The Civilian Review Board was active, and complaints about unfair stops were no longer ignored. For the first time in a long time, people in the community felt like their voices mattered. Malcolm had received numerous messages, some from citizens thanking him for pushing for change, others from officers who admitted they had never considered how their own biases influenced their decisions. He knew the road ahead was long, but progress had begun. One day, while heading into court, Malcolm noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance of the courthouse. Rick Sanders, now back in uniform. Malcolm hadn't seen him since their last conversation outside the courthouse, and he wondered what had come of his attempt to change. Sanders stepped forward and nodded. "Judge Carter," he said with more respect than before. Malcolm nodded back. "Officer Sanders. Back on duty, I see." "Yes," Sanders said. "After my suspension, I had to go through more training, more evaluations, but I made it through. And," he hesitated before continuing, "I asked to be reassigned to community outreach. I want to work with the people I once made feel unsafe." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. That wasn't the kind of decision officers made just to save face. It meant Sanders was serious about making amends. "That's a big step," Malcolm said. Sanders nodded. "I know, and I'm not expecting people to trust me overnight. But I need to do this the right way." He paused. "I just wanted to say thank you for not just punishing me, but giving me a chance to see where I went wrong." Malcolm studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Sanders hesitated but then shook it. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a silent understanding. A recognition that real change was possible when people were willing to listen and grow. As Sanders walked away, Malcolm stood for a moment, watching the busy city around him. He knew there were still problems in the system. There were still officers who would resist change, still people who would face unfair treatment. But for every step forward, something new became possible. One person standing up for justice could create a ripple effect. And tonight, Malcolm would go home knowing that he hadn't just changed one situation. He had helped change a system. And that was only the beginning. A few days later, Malcolm sat in a large conference room inside the police department. The atmosphere was tense, but he remained calm. Across from him sat Officer Sanders, now without his badge, looking uncomfortable. Next to him were Captain Rodriguez and the police chief, a serious-looking man with sharp eyes. Other senior officers were also present, all waiting to hear what Malcolm had to say. Malcolm folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Sanders. "Do you understand why we're here?" Sanders shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I made a mistake," he muttered. "I didn't check your ID when I should have." Malcolm nodded. "That's true. But the problem goes deeper than that. If I weren't a judge, would you have realized your mistake at all?" Sanders hesitated, then looked away. "I don't know," he admitted. "That's the issue," Malcolm said, his voice steady but firm. "You made a decision based on a feeling, not on facts. And that feeling led you to assume the worst about me without any reason." The room was silent. Some of the officers looked down at their hands. Others sat stiffly, uncomfortable with the truth being spoken so openly. The police chief finally spoke. "Judge Carter, I understand your frustration. This incident never should have happened. Officer Sanders has been suspended, and we are reviewing his actions carefully. What more do you suggest?" Malcolm leaned forward. "This isn't just about me. If this can happen to a sitting judge, It can happen to anyone, people without power, without influence. And I know that it does. He let that sink in before continuing. I don't want just one officer punished. I want real change in how stops like these are handled. The police chief listened carefully. What do you have in mind? I want mandatory bias training for all officers. Not just a one-time session, but regular education on how to recognize and correct these assumptions before they turn into incidents like mine. Rodriguez nodded, looking at the chief. That's reasonable. And honestly, it's overdue. Malcolm continued. I also want an open review board. A team of both officers and civilians to examine complaints about unfair stops. People need to know there's accountability. The chief sat back, considering the request. That would take some work to set up, he admitted, but it's possible. Sanders finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. What about me? Malcolm looked at him carefully. You have a choice. You can fight this and refuse to learn, or you can admit you were wrong and change. The decision is yours. Sanders swallowed hard, then nodded. I need to do better. Malcolm nodded, satisfied. Then let's start there. The chief took a deep breath and stood. Judge Carter, we'll make this right. For the first time since the traffic stop, Malcolm felt that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all of this.